I want to start with a question that may feel uncomfortable the moment you hear it. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like people saw right through you, not ignored in a rude way, not rejected in an obvious way, just quietly overlooked? I remember the first time I felt that shift. It did not happen all at once. There was no single moment I could point to. It was small, almost unnoticeable. I was standing in a conversation with people I had known for years. At some point, the topic changed. The energy shifted, and without anyone saying a word, I was no longer part of it. They kept talking. They kept laughing. But something had changed, and I felt it. It was not anger. It was not even sadness at first. It was confusion. A quiet kind of confusion that sits in your chest and does not leave. Because the truth is, I was still the same person. Same experiences, same thoughts, same voice. But somehow, the way I was being seen had changed. And I think if you are listening to this, you may have felt that too. Maybe not all at once. Maybe in small moments that you tried to ignore. The moment someone speaks over you without realizing it. The moment your opinion is acknowledged but not really heard. The moment you stop trying to add something because it feels like it no longer matters. These are not loud moments. They do not leave obvious marks, but they add up. And over time, they create something much heavier than people expect. They create the feeling of becoming invisible. Most people never talk about this. It feels too small to explain, too subtle to justify. But the emotional weight of it is real, and it grows quietly. Because when the world starts to treat you differently, you begin to ask a question that is hard to answer. Did something change out there? Or did something change in me? And what I discovered when I finally faced that question changed the way I see aging, identity, and even my own life. There is something I need to say before we go any further. This feeling you are carrying is not small. It may look small from the outside, but from the inside, it changes everything. I did not understand that at first. I told myself I was imagining things. I thought maybe I was just being sensitive. Maybe people were busy. Maybe nothing had really changed. But over time, the pattern became harder to ignore. The small moments kept repeating, and each one left a mark I could not quite explain. I started noticing how often I was interrupted, not intentionally, just casually, as if what I was saying could wait. I noticed how quickly conversations moved past me, as if my words carried less weight than they used to. And the hardest part was this. Nobody meant to hurt me. That made it even more confusing. Because when there is no clear cause, there is no clear place to put the pain. So it turns inward. You begin to question yourself in ways you never did before. You wonder if you are repeating yourself too much. You wonder if your thoughts sound outdated. You wonder if your presence is becoming less important. And I think you know exactly what I am talking about. In a country like America, where speed and relevance are everything, this shift becomes even more powerful. People move fast. Trends change quickly. Attention follows what feels new. And slowly, without anyone deciding it, those who are older begin to fade into the background of that movement, not because they have less to offer, but because the world has quietly decided to look somewhere else. That is the part nobody prepares you for. Retirement is talked about, health is talked about, money is talked about, but this quiet shift in how you are seen is almost never discussed. And when it happens, it can shake something deep inside you, something tied to your sense of worth, something tied to your place in the world. You may still be surrounded by people. You may still be part of conversations, but inside, something feels different. It feels like you are slowly disappearing in plain sight, and the emotional cost of that feeling is heavier than most people ever admit. Because once you start to feel invisible, it becomes harder to believe that you still matter in the same way. But the moment you first feel this shift is only the beginning. What comes after, it reveals something even more difficult to face. I remember a time when respect felt different. It was not loud, it was not forced, but it was real. People listened all the way through when you spoke. They asked questions. They stayed present in the moment. Somewhere along the way, that changed. Now the respect I receive often feels softer, more careful, almost like people are trying to be kind instead of being engaged. At first, that sounds like a good thing. Kindness is not a problem, but this is not the same as respect. I began to notice it in small ways. Someone would nod while I was speaking, but their attention was already somewhere else. Someone would say, "That is interesting," but they would not build on the idea. The conversation would move forward, but not because of anything I said. It felt like I was being included out of politeness, not because my voice truly mattered in that moment. And I think many of you have felt that difference. There is a quiet shift between being valued and being tolerated, and it is not always easy to see at first. Psychology has a simple way of explaining this. People are often drawn to what feels current and fast-moving. It is not always intentional. It is a pattern of attention. In a culture like America, where everything moves quickly, attention becomes a kind of currency, and over time, that currency shifts away from those who are seen as slower or less current. That does not mean you have less wisdom. It does not mean you have less to offer. But it does change how others respond in subtle ways. The hardest part is not what people say. It is what they stop doing. They stop asking for your perspective. They stop waiting for your full thought. They stop leaning in the way they used to. And slowly, respect begins to feel like politeness. That difference is quiet, but it carries a weight that is hard to describe. Because deep down, you can feel it, even when nobody says a word. But what I realized after sitting with this feeling surprised me even more, because the shift in respect was only the surface of something much deeper. There came a point when I started to notice something even more subtle. It was not just how people responded to me. It was how often they stopped turning to me at all. I would be sitting in a room where ideas were being shared, decisions were being made, voices were being heard, and mine was simply not part of it anymore. Not because I had nothing to say, but because no one thought to ask. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. It was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet and steady, a slow understanding that something I once had was fading. There was a time when people would come to me for advice. They would ask what I thought before making a decision. They valued my experience. Then gradually, that stopped happening. I told myself it was just timing. I told myself people were figuring things out on their own, but the truth felt different. It felt like I was becoming less relevant in the eyes of others. And I think that word matters here, relevant, because relevance is not about truth or wisdom. It is about perception. Psychology tells us that people often seek input from those they believe understand the present moment best, not necessarily those who understand life the deepest. That is a hard truth to accept. In a world that changes quickly, especially in America, what feels current often replaces what is actually meaningful. Technology moves fast, trends move faster, and attention follows whatever seems closest to now. So even if you carry decades of experience, it can feel like it no longer fits the pace of the world around you. That does not mean it has no value, but it does mean it is not always recognized the way it once was. And over time, that lack of recognition begins to change how you see yourself. You may start to speak less. You may hold back your thoughts. You may convince yourself that it is easier to stay quiet. And that is how relevance slowly fades. Not all at once, but piece by piece. But the deeper truth behind this loss is something most people never stop to question. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. After a while, I began to notice something that felt even heavier than being overlooked. It was the silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence. Not the kind you choose. This was different. This was the silence that slowly replaces your place in other people's lives. The phone stopped ringing as often. Messages became shorter. Invitations became less frequent. At first, there was always a reason. People were busy. Schedules were full. Life was moving fast. That is what I told myself. But over time, the pattern became clear. It was not just that people were busy. It was that I was no longer part of their busy. That realization is difficult to put into words because nobody sits you down and says it. It just happens quietly. I remember weekends that used to feel full. Plans made in advance. People dropping by without needing a reason. And then slowly, those moments became rare. Then they became memories. Psychology has a simple explanation for this. As people age, their social circles become smaller. Energy becomes more limited. Priorities shift inward. In a place like America, where life already leans toward independence, this shrinking becomes even more noticeable. People focus on their own households, their own routines, their own responsibilities, and without realizing it, connections that once felt strong begin to loosen. That does not always mean rejection, but it feels like it because silence leaves space for interpretation, and the mind does not like empty space, so it fills that space with questions. Did I do something wrong? Did I say something I should not have? Do I still matter to them? And I think you have asked yourself at least one of those questions. The hardest part is this. You can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. That kind of loneliness is quiet, but it reaches deep. And yet, the most painful part is not the silence itself. It is what that silence makes you start to believe about yourself. There was a point when the silence stopped feeling external. It started to feel internal. I began to notice how my thoughts had changed, not about others, about myself. I would replay conversations in my head long after they ended. I would wonder if I had said too much, or maybe not enough. I started questioning things that once felt natural. Simple things, like when to speak, or whether to speak at all. That kind of hesitation was new to me. There was a time when I trusted my voice. I did not second-guess every word. I spoke because I had something to say. Now, there was a pause inside me before every sentence, and I think many of you know that pause. It is not visible to others, but you feel it every time. Psychology calls this a shift in self-perception. When external feedback changes, even in subtle ways, the mind begins to adjust how it sees itself, not because you are less capable, but because your environment is sending different signals. Over time, those signals begin to shape your inner voice. You may start to believe that your ideas are less important. You may assume that others are more relevant than you, and without realizing it, you begin to step back. Not because you have nothing to offer, but because it feels like there is less space for you. That is how invisibility becomes internal. It is no longer just something happening around you. It becomes something happening within you. And that shift is powerful, because once you start to see yourself differently, everything else begins to follow that pattern. You speak less. You share less. You show up differently. And the world responds to that change, which only reinforces the feeling even more. It becomes a quiet cycle. And breaking that cycle is not as simple as deciding to speak up again, because the real challenge is not outside, it is inside. And this is where many people begin to lose something far more important than attention. They begin to lose their sense of who they are. But what happens next goes even deeper than self-doubt. It touches something at the core of identity itself. There was a time when I knew exactly who I was, not in a loud or proud way, just in a quiet, steady way that felt certain. I had a role, I had a place, I had people who depended on me. A lot of that came from work, some of it came from family, and some of it came from the way others responded to me. Then slowly, those things began to change. Retirement took away the structure I had lived with for decades. The daily rhythm disappeared. The sense of being needed in the same way faded. At first, it felt like relief. I thought I was finally free. But that silence was heavier than I expected, because without those roles, something else started to shift. I was no longer being introduced the same way, no longer seen through the same lens, no longer defined by what I used to do. And that created a question I had never needed to ask before. Who am I now? That question stayed with me longer than I wanted. It followed me into quiet moments. It showed up when I had nothing to distract me. Psychology explains this more simply than we expect. A large part of identity is built around roles. When those roles change or disappear, the sense of self can feel unstable. In a culture like America, where identity is often tied to career and productivity, this shift can feel even stronger. Because when the work stops, many people feel like a part of them stops with it. That is not the truth, but it can feel like the truth. And when that feeling combines with being treated differently by others, it becomes even harder to separate who you are from how you are seen. You may start to feel like you are fading, not just socially, but personally. And that is a difficult place to sit with, because losing a clear sense of identity is not loud. It is quiet and unsettling. But the realization that changed everything for me did not come from others. It came from finally seeing something I had ignored for years. It took me a long time to admit something that now feels obvious. Most of what I was feeling was not coming from people trying to push me away. It was coming from something much quieter than that. People were not sitting around deciding to treat me differently. They were simply moving through their own lives, focused on their own pressures, their own routines, their own concerns. And without realizing it, their attention shifted. That shift felt personal, but most of the time, it was not. That was a hard truth to accept, because it is easier to believe that something is being done to you. It is harder to accept that something is simply happening around you. Psychology explains this in a simple way. The mind is wired to look for meaning. When something changes, it tries to assign a reason. If no clear reason appears, it often turns inward and creates one. That is how we begin to believe that we are the cause. But in reality, much of what we experience in this stage of life comes from unconscious patterns in others. People connect with what feels familiar to their current world. They respond to what feels immediate. They invest energy where they feel it is most needed. And over time, those patterns reshape how they interact with us, not out of rejection, but out of habit. Understanding that does not remove the feeling, but it changes how heavy it feels. It removes some of the personal weight we carry, because not everything is about us. And I think you know how easy it is to forget that. We carry silent conclusions for years. We build stories in our minds that feel real. But when you step back and look closely, you begin to see something different. You begin to see that much of this invisibility is unspoken, not intentional, not designed to hurt, just quietly happening in the background of everyday life. And when I finally accepted that, something inside me began to shift, not outside, inside. And what I discovered after that acceptance was something I had never expected to learn this late in life. There is a moment I remember very clearly. It did not feel important at the time, but looking back, it changed everything. I was sitting alone after a conversation that had ended earlier than expected. Nothing dramatic happened. No argument. No clear reason to feel upset, but I felt something I could not ignore. A quiet realization that I had been measuring my value through how others responded to me. That thought stayed with me, because if your sense of worth depends on constant recognition, then even small changes in attention can feel like loss. And in later life, those changes are natural. People move differently. Attention shifts. Energy is distributed in new directions. But when your identity is tied too closely to external validation, those shifts feel personal. That is where the real struggle begins. Not in what others are doing, but in how deeply we depend on it to feel seen. I started noticing something about myself at that point. On the days I felt included, I felt strong. On the days I felt overlooked, I felt smaller. That was not stability. That was dependence. And I think many people over 65 quietly experience the same thing. Psychology calls this external validation dependency. It is when your internal sense of worth is shaped heavily by outside feedback. Over time, this becomes fragile because the world is always changing and attention is never constant. But here is what I did not understand earlier. My value did not disappear when attention changed. It only felt like it did. That feeling was not truth. It was interpretation. And once I began to separate those two things, something inside me softened. I stopped assuming silence meant rejection. I stopped assuming distance meant loss of worth. And I began to see something clearer. People were not measuring me the way I was measuring myself. They were simply living. And that realization created a kind of space I had not felt in a long time. Space to breathe without interpreting everything as a judgment. But the deepest understanding did not come from this alone. It came from one final truth I had been avoiding for years. And once I saw it, I could not go back to how I used to think. There is something I avoided facing for a long time, not because it was complicated, but because it was uncomfortable to accept. The truth is, people were never going to see me exactly the same way at every stage of life. That sounds simple when I say it now, but it took me years to understand it. We expect continuity in how we are seen. We expect people to carry forward the same image of us forever. But life does not work that way. People change. Circumstances change. Attention changes. And in that movement, perception changes too. I used to think that meant something was being lost. But now I see it differently. It is not always loss. Sometimes it is transition. Psychology explains this through familiarity. People connect most strongly with what fits their current environment. That means even if you have not changed at your core, the way others relate to you can still shift as their world shifts. And in America especially, where life is fast-moving and future-focused, the present moment often dominates attention. What is current feels more visible. What is slower feels more distant. That is not personal rejection. That is social rhythm. But emotionally, it still feels personal. And that is where the conflict lives, because your experience is real. Even if the cause is not what you assumed, you feel less seen. You feel quieter in conversations. You feel like you are standing slightly outside of where things are happening. And none of that is imagined. The feeling is real, even if the meaning behind it is different than what we first believe. Once I understood that, something softened inside me. I stopped trying to force old versions of connection to return. I stopped interpreting every shift as a decline in my worth. And I started paying attention to something else, the relationships that remained steady, the moments where I was still fully heard, the people who still valued presence over speed. They were still there, just quieter than before. And that changed my focus, because instead of asking why I am being seen less, I began asking where I am still truly seen. And that shift brought me to a realization I did not expect. What I thought was becoming invisibility was actually an invitation to see life in a different way. I want to end this with something I wish someone had told me earlier in life. The feeling of becoming invisible after 65 is real. I am not going to pretend it is not. You feel it in conversations. You feel it in silence. You feel it in the spaces where you used to feel included without effort. But here is what I finally came to understand. You are not disappearing as a person. You are changing in how the world responds to you. Those are not the same thing. For a long time, I confused the two. If I was not being noticed the same way, I assumed I mattered less. If I was not being asked as often, I assumed my value had faded. But that was not reality. That was interpretation shaped by emotion. When I looked at my life more honestly, I saw something different. The same experiences were still mine, the same memories, the same lessons, the same depth of understanding that only time can give you. None of that had disappeared. What had changed was visibility, not value, and that distinction matters more than I can explain. Because once you separate who you are from how often you are seen, something inside you becomes steadier again. I stopped chasing the version of myself that existed in other people's reactions. I stopped measuring my life by attention. And slowly, I started to feel more grounded again. Not because the world changed, but because my interpretation of it did. And I think this is the part many people miss. The goal is not to be seen the same way forever. That is not how life works. The real goal is to stop letting visibility define your worth. You can still matter deeply, even when you are not the center of every room. You can still have wisdom, even when fewer people ask for it. You can still have presence, even when the world feels louder than you. And maybe that is the quiet truth of aging that nobody really explains. It is not just about what you lose. It is about what you finally stop needing from the outside world. And when that shift happens, something unexpected becomes possible. A kind of peace that is not dependent on being noticed. A kind of strength that does not need constant validation. Maybe the hardest part was never becoming invisible. Maybe it was learning that you were never as dependent on visibility as you once believed.